Ответ. Gemini. The autumn of 1918. The Argonne Forest, France. If you open a standard military history textbook and read about the final, bloody months of the First World War, you will read about the horrifying scale of the surface war. You will see black and white photographs of massive artillery barrages tearing the earth to shreds, endless miles of rusted barbed wire, and the suffocating terror of mustard gas drifting across the shattered, muddy crater fields. The official narrative is one of massive, mechanized armies clashing in the open air. But hidden deep within the heavily redacted, classified trench logs of the Allied High Command is the story of a completely different, entirely invisible war. It is the terrifying story of a claustrophobic, subterranean massacre that the military establishment immediately covered up. They buried the truth because acknowledging it would mean admitting that the deadliest, most physics-defying ambush of the entire Western Front was not engineered by elite generals or heavily armed infantry. It was built 40 feet underground by a handful of forgotten blue-collar laborers, armed with nothing but heavy iron shovels, a hand-cranked fan, and the terrifying, invisible laws of subterranean chemistry. 40 feet below the deafening, earth-shaking thunder of the surface artillery, the temperature in the tunnels dropped rapidly, and the air turned into a thick, suffocating paste. It was a pitch-black, heavily timbered mining shaft, violently carved straight through the dense, wet clay and choking white chalk of the French earth. Huddled in the absolute, crushing darkness of this subterranean coffin were 10 men. They were not elite, highly trained combat infantrymen. They were not decorated sharpshooters. They were 10 African-American trench diggers, officially designated as a labor pioneer squad. In the rigidly segregated, deeply prejudiced military machine of 1918, these men were handed heavy iron pickaxes instead of rifles. They were the invisible, expendable backbone of the trench network, ordered to break their backs in the suffocating darkness, digging the massive listening posts and sapper tunnels so the aristocratic officers could safely maneuver above ground. They were completely covered from head to toe in thick, wet gray clay and blinding white chalk dust, their heavy canvas gas masks hanging uselessly around their exhausted necks. And right now, they were entirely trapped. Just minutes ago, the heavy, reinforced wooden trapdoor at the top of their entrance shaft had been violently blown apart by concentrated high explosives. Filtering down through the narrow, vertical 40-foot drop was the terrifying, unmistakable sound of heavy, hobnailed combat boots hitting the wooden rungs of the descent ladder. It was not a standard enemy patrol. It was a highly specialized, elite raiding party of German Stormtroopers, the Sturmtruppen. They were heavily armed, ruthless trench clearers, wearing heavy steel helmets, carrying devastating pump-action trench shotguns, and holding harsh electric flashlights that violently cut through the subterranean darkness like the eyes of a predator. They were descending rapidly into the shaft, tasked with systematically clearing the tunnel network and slaughtering anyone hiding in the dark. The 10 African-American diggers clutched the heavy wooden handles of their iron shovels and pickaxes, staring blindly into the pitch-black corridor. They were 10 exhausted laborers, trapped in a dead-end tunnel, facing a squad of elite, heavily armed killers. According to every established rule of military combat, their lives were already over. But the heavily armed stormtroopers descending into the dark, and the cowardly Allied officer who had explicitly left the diggers down there to die, both made the exact same fatal miscalculation. They completely underestimated the raw, working-class genius of the man standing at the front of the tunnel. Because leaning against a massive, heavy wooden support beam, completely unbothered by the echoing sound of the approaching boots, was Sergeant Cole Davis. He was a massive, broad-shouldered man who had spent his entire life swinging a heavy pickaxe in the deep, lethal, completely unforgiving coal mines of West Virginia. He was not looking at the tunnel entrance. He was sniffing the heavy, dead air. And he was doing the terrifying, cold math of subterranean combustion. Just 30 minutes before the heavy, hobnailed boots of the German stormtroopers began echoing down the vertical shaft, The subterranean tunnel was a scene of panicked Dick, absolute betrayal. The heavy, reinforced wooden trap door 40 feet above them had swung violently open, dumping a shower of loose, wet mud down the ladder. Scrambling down into the suffocating, pitch-black darkness was their commanding officer, a young, aristocratic Allied lieutenant who had spent the entire offensive safely entrenched in a reinforced, concrete-lined command bunker miles behind the front lines. He wore a pristine, perfectly tailored wool uniform, and a gleaming bifle, unblemished, polished brass compass hung around his neck. He had not come down into the claustrophobic, chalk-choked mine shaft to check on his men. He had come to use them as human sandbags. Through the narrow opening at the top of the shaft, the deafening, earth-shattering roar of a massive German counteroffensive was violently tearing the surface trenches to pieces. The High Command's lines had completely collapsed. The lieutenant's eyes were wide with raw, unadulterated panic. He looked at the 10 exhausted African-American laborers whose hands were blistered and bleeding from digging for 16 hours straight in the freezing, wet clay. Sergeant Cole Davis, his massive shoulders aching and his lungs burning from the thick chalk dust, stepped forward. He respectfully informed the panicked officer that the main tunnel was a dead end. They had hit a solid wall of dense, impenetrable bedrock. They needed to immediately evacuate up the ladder before the advancing enemy forces completely overran the trench above and dropped high-explosive grenades down the shaft. But the lieutenant did not even look Cole in the eye. In the rigid, deeply prejudiced military hierarchy of 1918, the officer did not see 10 brave men who had just broken their backs carving a vital artery beneath the battlefield. He saw 10 expendable, heavily muscled laborers holding iron shovels. He saw a fleshy roadblock. "You are a labor pioneer squad, Sergeant," the lieutenant stammered, his voice trembling as a massive artillery shell violently shook the earth above them, raining dust down from the heavy timber beams. "Your orders are to hold this subterranean intersection. You will not abandon this shaft under any circumstances." Cole gripped the heavy wooden handle of his pickaxe. He explained, his deep voice echoing in the tight space, that they did not have rifles. They did not have grenades. If elite enemy stormtroopers breached the tunnel, iron shovels would be absolutely mathematically useless against pump-action trench shotguns in a confined, narrow space. The lieutenant's face flushed with a cowardly, defensive rage. He violently pointed his pristine leather riding crop at the massive West Virginia coal miner. "You will hold the line with whatever tools you have, Sergeant. That is a direct order," the lieutenant screamed, completely ignoring the absolute suicidal absurdity of his command. He did not hand them a single spare revolver. He did not offer to stay and fight alongside them. He simply turned his back, frantically grabbed the wooden rungs of the ladder, and climbed back up toward the surface as fast as his pristine boots could carry him. The moment the coward reached the top, he slammed the heavy, reinforced wooden trapdoor entirely shut behind him, violently throwing the heavy iron deadbolt. He explicitly, intentionally, sealed 10 unarmed men inside a pitch-black, 40-foot-deep subterranean coffin, using their inevitable bloody slaughter to buy himself exactly 5 extra minutes to safely run away from the front lines. The profound, suffocating darkness that instantly swallowed the 10 diggers was infinitely heavier than the French earth surrounding them. They had survived the most brutal, back-breaking labor of the war, only to be thrown away like broken tools by a man who wanted to protect his own shiny brass compass. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been completely thrown under the bus by a panicking, incompetent manager who explicitly sacrificed your team just to save their own skin when a massive project collapsed? Drop your story in the comments right now, because the lethal, invisible trap these diggers are about to build in the dark is going to be the ultimate, physics-defying revenge. The heavy, suffocating darkness of the sealed tunnel was instantly shattered by the terrifying, deafening boom of the stormtroopers blowing the trapdoor at the top of the shaft. The 10 abandoned African-American trench diggers were locked in a pitch-black, 40-foot-deep subterranean tomb. The only light came from a single, heavily dimmed brass oil lantern hanging from a wooden support beam, casting long, frantic shadows against the wet, chalk-covered walls. The younger laborers gripped their heavy iron shovels, their chests heaving with raw panic. They could clearly hear the heavy, metallic clink of enemy weapons and the rhythmic thud of hobnailed boots rapidly descending the wooden ladder. They were cornered. They were unarmed. They were waiting to be slaughtered in the dark. But Sergeant Cole Davis did not raise his iron pickaxe. He held up a massive, clay-caked hand, commanding his terrified men to absolute, dead silence. Cole did not come from a wealthy, aristocratic military family. He had never studied infantry flanking maneuvers or trench warfare tactics. Before the draft board pulled his number, Cole was a heavy excavator. He was a massive, broad-shouldered man who had spent his entire life hundreds of feet below the surface, swinging a pickaxe in the deep, completely unforgiving, lethal coal mines of West Virginia. He was a man who understood the subterranean world, not as a battlefield, but as a living, breathing, terrifyingly volatile physical entity. He had seen the deep, crushing darkness of the Appalachian Mountains instantly vaporize entire crews of experienced miners. He respected the catastrophic, invisible chemistry of the earth far more than he respected any German Stormtrooper. Cole closed his eyes, entirely ignoring the echoing boots of the approaching executioners, and focused all of his heightened, working-class senses on the heavy, dead air of the tunnel. When the massive, high-explosive artillery shells from the German counteroffensive violently pounded the earth above them, the shock waves had not just shattered the trenches. The immense seismic pressure had violently fractured the deep, impenetrable bedrock surrounding their tunnel, cracking open a pressurized ancient subterranean pocket of trapped gas, methane. In the lethal, chemical, claustrophobic coal mines of West Virginia, they called it fire damp. It is a highly combustible, invisible, entirely odorless gas that silently bleeds into enclosed shafts, displacing the oxygen and creating a catastrophic, ticking thermobaric time bomb. Cole could not smell the gas, but his seasoned miner's instincts caught the terrifying, undeniable warning signs. His ears picked up a microscopic, high-pressure hiss bleeding through the microscopic fissures in the white chalk walls. But the absolute, mathematical proof was hanging right above his head. Cole slowly opened his eyes and stared intensely at the single, flickering brass oil lantern. The normally bright yellow flame had violently shrunk down to a tiny, trembling spark, and completely surrounding that spark was a sickly, glowing, pale blue halo. To an aristocratic, academy-trained Allied officer, a blue flame meant absolutely nothing. But to a blue-collar West Virginia coal miner, the blue halo on a lantern was the absolute, undeniable visual confirmation of a lethal, highly concentrated methane saturation. They were standing directly inside a massive, unignited, fuel-air explosive pocket. The terrified diggers saw nothing but a dead end and a firing squad. But the massive Appalachian miner saw an arsenal. Cole slowly lowered his gaze from the glowing blue lantern down to the muddy floor of the tunnel. Sitting completely useless in the wet clay was the squad's heavy, hand-cranked canvas ventilation blower. A massive, iron-geared fan designed to pump fresh surface air down into the deep shafts to keep the diggers from suffocating. In the brilliant working-class mind of the coal miner, an impossible, devastating chemical equation violently clicked into place. He knew a terrifying, immutable law of subterranean physics that the arrogant military establishment completely ignored. Methane gas alone is highly flammable, but when it is violently, mechanically mixed with heavy concentrations of dry, suspended chalk and coal dust, it does not just burn. It creates an invisible, hypervolatile, thermobaric vacuum matrix. If ignited, it generates a supersonic, catastrophic shockwave that instantly vaporizes everything in the confined space and violently sucks all the oxygen out of the air. Cole was not going to fight a squad of elite, heavily armed stormtroopers with iron shovels. He was going to use the heavy canvas blower, the blinding white chalk dust, and the lethal, invisible physics of the earth to violently turn the entire tunnel into the barrel of a massive gun. "Drop the pickaxes!" Cole's deep, booming voice violently shattered the suffocating, terrified silence of the pitch-black tunnel. He did not wait for his trembling, exhausted men to process the command. Cole lunged through the knee-deep, freezing mud and grabbed the heavy cast-iron crank of the massive canvas ventilation blower sitting dead in the clay. It was a heavy, primitive industrial machine, a massive iron gearbox attached to thick, accordion-like canvas lungs, designed exclusively to pump fresh, breathable surface air down into the deep subterranean shafts to keep the diggers alive. But Cole was not trying to save their breath. He was building a bomb. "Grab the crank," Cole roared, pointing his massive, clay-caked hand at the two largest diggers in the squad. "I am stripping the forward gears. You are going to crank this blower entirely in reverse, and you are not going to stop until your arms completely give out." The terrified African-American laborers stared at the massive West Virginia coal miner through the suffocating darkness. Above them, the heavy, rhythmic thud of the elite German Stormtroopers hitting the bottom of the wooden ladder echoed violently down the narrow corridor. The enemy raiding party had breached the floor. The diggers were completely out of time. Driven by pure, blinding panic and the undeniable, absolute authority of a blue-collar foreman who understood the lethal mechanics of the earth, the men threw their useless iron shovels into the mud. They grabbed the heavy iron handles of the massive blower and began to violently, desperately crank the gears backward. The heavy machinery shrieked in the darkness. The massive canvas lungs violently expanded and contracted in reverse. Instead of pushing clean air into the tunnel, the reversed blower created a massive, localized mechanical vacuum. It began violently sucking the dead, stagnant air from the deepest, dead-end corners of the subterranean shaft, and forcefully, violently churning it directly into the center of the claustrophobic corridor. "Kick the walls!" Cole bellowed, his voice echoing over the mechanical shriek of the blower. "Kick the dry chalk! Fill the air with dust!" The remaining diggers frantically began kicking and smashing the dry, blinding white chalk deposits lining the heavy timber walls of the tunnel. Thick, choking clouds of ultra-fine, highly combustible chalk and coal dust violently billowed into the air. To the arrogant, academy-trained Allied lieutenant who had abandoned them, dirt was just dirt. But to the massive Appalachian miner, that ultra-fine dust was the missing catalyst. The massive canvas blower was violently, mechanically mixing the thick clouds of dry, suspended chalk dust directly with the massive, invisible pocket of highly concentrated methane gas bleeding from the fractured bedrock. Cole was intentionally, meticulously engineering a massive, catastrophic fuel-air explosive matrix. By forcefully suspending the combustible dust particles inside the volatile methane gas, he was creating a terrifying, invisible, thermobaric atmosphere that would violently flash incinerate the absolute second it was introduced to a spark. The air inside the tunnel grew impossibly thick, completely saturated with the lethal, invisible chemical cocktail. The men were violently coughing, their lungs burning as they cranked the heavy iron gears, completely unaware that they were standing directly inside the barrel of a subterranean shotgun. And echoing down the pitch-black corridor, completely cutting through the mechanical shriek of the canvas blower, came the terrifying, metallic clack, clack of a German pump-action trench shotgun chambering a heavy buckshot shell. The stormtroopers had entered the tunnel. Tell us in the comments, what would you do if you were entirely abandoned 40 feet underground in a pitch-black, collapsing tunnel with absolutely no weapons and a squad of heavily armed killers marching directly toward you? Would you surrender in the dark? Or would you trust a coal miner to build an impossible, physics-defying trap? Drop your exact survival strategy below, because this invisible bomb is about to violently erase the enemy from existence. The heavy, metallic clack, clack of the pump-action trench shotgun echoing down the claustrophobic corridor was the universal, terrifying sound of an execution. At the base of the shattered vertical wooden shaft, the elite German stormtroopers quickly fanned out into the pitch-black tunnel. These were the Sturmtruppen, the apex predators of the 1918 Western Front. They were highly trained, ruthless shock troops, explicitly designed to violently breach and clear the most heavily fortified Allied trenches. They wore heavy, coal-scuttle steel helmets and carried a devastating arsenal of close-quarters weaponry. Sharpened entrenching tools, bundled stick grenades, and brutal, short-barreled shotguns. The suffocating, crushing darkness of the subterranean mine did not slow them down. With a series of sharp, mechanical clicks, the raiding party ignited their heavy, battery-powered electric flashlights. Blinding, harsh white beams of light violently cut through the pitch-black tunnel. The electric beams swept across the wet clay walls and the heavy, splintering timber supports, slicing through the incredibly thick bone. Swirling clouds of white chalk dust that Cole and his men had just violently kicked into the air. The stormtroopers moved forward with absolute funger, predatory confidence. Bukter, they marched in a tight feetman, disciplined tactical formation, their heavy, hobnailed boots violently crunching against the muddy floor. Bukter, they had already slaughtered the Allied infantry above ground. To them, this dark, dead-end tunnel was nothing more than a mop-up operation. Bukter, they fully expected to find a handful of terrified unarmed laborers cowering in the mud, begging for mercy. They marched straight past the halfway point of the tunnel, their electric flashlights completely illuminating the dense, choking white fog. The arrogant, heavily armed German commander at the front of the formation sneered behind his thick wool collar. He saw the incredibly thick concentration of chalk and coal dust suspended in the air, but his academy-trained mind dismissed it entirely. He assumed the heavy dust was simply the chaotic aftermath of the surface artillery shaking the earth, or the pathetic result of the trapped diggers panicking in the dark. He had absolutely no idea that he was not just walking through dust. He was marching his entire squad directly into the center of a perfectly mixed, highly concentrated, invisible, thermobaric vacuum bomb. At the very back of the dead-end corridor, partially shielded behind a massive, reinforced wooden support column, Sergeant Cole Davis stood perfectly still. The massive West Virginia coal miner had ordered his exhausted men to completely stop cranking the canvas blower. The mechanical shriek of the gears had died away, leaving only the heavy, terrified breathing of the diggers and the rhythmic, approaching footsteps of the executioners. The air in the confined space was now absolutely, perfectly primed. The invisible methane gas from the fractured bedrock was violently, thoroughly saturated with the highly combustible, ultrafine chalk dust. It was a massive, lethal fuel-air matrix, completely filling the last 50 feet of the tunnel. The blinding beams of the German flashlights suddenly swept across the end of the corridor, snapping directly onto the exhausted, clay-caked faces of the 10 African-American diggers. The stormtrooper commander shouted a harsh, guttural order. The elite raiding party instantly raised their devastating pump-action shotguns, aiming directly at the unarmed laborers' chests. The execution was perfectly lined up. The Germans had the overwhelming firepower, the tactical high ground, and the element of absolute terror. But they did not have the light. Cole did not flinch. He did not raise an iron shovel. The massive Appalachian miner slowly reached behind the wooden support beam and picked up the single, heavily dimmed brass oil lantern. The tiny, trembling yellow flame was still entirely surrounded by that sickly, glowing blue halo, the absolute, undeniable proof of the invisible methane. Cole locked eyes with the heavily armed German commander through the thick, explosive fog. And then, the blue-collar trucker of the earth prepared to violently pull the trigger on the mountain. The blinding, harsh electric beams of the German flashlights violently illuminated Sergeant Cole Davis, but the massive West Virginia coal miner did not raise his hands in surrender. He stood perfectly still in the suffocating, chalk-choked darkness of the dead-end tunnel, holding the single, heavily dimmed brass oil lantern right at chest level. To the highly trained, aristocratic German commander staring down the barrel of his pump-action trench shotgun, the scene made absolutely no tactical sense. He was looking at a cornered, unarmed laborer holding a dying light. He tightened his heavy leather-gloved finger against the cold steel of the trigger, preparing to violently execute the entire squad. But the Stormtrooper commander did not understand the terrifying, invisible chemistry of the Earth. In the lethal, completely unforgiving depths of the Appalachian coal mines, a dust explosion is the absolute, ultimate nightmare. It is a catastrophic event governed by strict, unyielding laws of physics. Methane gas, the silent, invisible fire damp currently bleeding from the violently fractured bedrock, is highly combustible on its own. But when that gas is mechanically, violently churned together with thousands of ultra-fine, bone-dry particles of suspended chalk and coal dust, it fundamentally changes the mathematical equation of the blast. The invisible methane provides the initial, highly volatile ignition source, but the thick, choking cloud of dry dust that the diggers had just violently kicked into the air acts as a massive, supersonic multiplier. When a spark is introduced to a perfectly mixed fuel-air matrix, like the one currently entirely filling the last 50 feet of the tunnel, it does not just create a localized fire. It creates a catastrophic, cascading thermobaric chain reaction. The methane ignites, instantly flash-baking the suspended dust particles, which violently rupture and release their own thermal energy in a fraction of a millisecond. It generates an unyielding, supersonic shockwave of expanding plasma that travels faster than the speed of sound, violently incinerating everything in its path, while simultaneously sucking every single molecule of oxygen out of the confined space. Cole was not holding a lantern. He was holding the detonator to a massive subterranean vacuum bomb. The heavy, dead air inside the claustrophobic corridor was so thoroughly, perfectly saturated with the invisible methane and chalk dust that the tiny, trembling yellow flame inside the brass lantern was violently fighting to stay alive. The sickly, glowing blue halo surrounding the wick was violently expanding, physically reaching out toward the explosive atmosphere, pressing against the thin glass. The German commander barked a final, guttural order to fire. The elite stormtroopers braced their heavy weapons against their shoulders, completely oblivious to the fact that they were standing directly inside the barrel of a loaded cannon. Cole looked at his exhausted, terrified diggers, who were pressed completely flat against the damp clay floor behind the heavy timber supports. He looked back at the blinding electric flashlights of the executioners, and then the massive, blue-collar trucker of the earth smoothly, deliberately, unlatched the heavy brass cage of the lantern and violently shattered the protective glass directly into the explosive fog. The precise fraction of a millisecond that the shattered glass fell away, the tiny, trembling yellow flame of the brass lantern was entirely exposed to the heavily saturated, claustrophobic atmosphere of the dead-end tunnel. The sickly, glowing blue halo did not just flicker. It violently, catastrophically jumped. When the raw, uninsulated spark of the wick made direct contact with the perfectly mixed, invisible fuel-air matrix of methane and suspended chalk dust, the fundamental laws of subterranean chemistry violently took over. It did not create a standard rolling fireball. It triggered an instantaneous, localized, thermobaric chain reaction. A blinding, impossible flash of pure, hyperthermal white plasma violently eradicated the pitch-black darkness of the mineshaft. It was brighter than the midday sun, a terrifying, man-made star igniting 40 feet beneath the surface of the Earth. The elite German stormtroopers never even had the mechanical time to pull the heavy steel triggers of their pump-action shotguns. Human reflexes operate in milliseconds. A fuel-air explosive shockwave travels at supersonic velocity. The violent ignition of the invisible methane instantly flash-baked the millions of suspended, bone-dry particles of chalk and coal dust hanging in the air. Those microscopic particles violently ruptured, releasing their own massive thermal payloads simultaneously. The resulting catastrophic, outward-expanding shockwave of raw kinetic energy and searing heat slammed into the heavily armed raiding party with the unyielding, crushing force of a freight train. The physics of a confined thermobaric blast are completely merciless. The supersonic pressure wave violently lifted the stormtroopers entirely off their feet, instantly shattering their heavy, coal-scuttle steel helmets and rendering their devastating close-quarters weaponry completely useless. But the kinetic impact was only the first half of the execution. As the catastrophic fireball violently expanded down the narrow, timber-lined corridor, it violently consumed every single molecule of oxygen in the confined space. It created a massive, localized mechanical vacuum. The sheer, terrifying negative pressure violently sucked the air directly out of the German soldiers' lungs, neutralizing the apex predators of the Western Front in a blinding, deafening fraction of a second. The colossal, expanding shockwave violently rolled straight up the tunnel, following the path of the oxygen, and slammed directly into the heavily compromised, violently fractured bedrock near the vertical entrance shaft. The massive, ancient stone and heavy timber supports, already weakened by the surface artillery, catastrophically failed under the millions of pounds of outward hydraulic pressure. With a deafening, earth-shattering roar that drowned out the artillery barrage above, the entire front half of the tunnel violently collapsed. Hundreds of tons of wet clay, dense bedrock, and shattered timber violently crashed down, completely burying the vaporized remains of the raiding party and permanently sealing the vertical shaft. At the very back of the dead-end corridor, Sergeant Cole Davis and his 10 African-American diggers were violently thrown against the damp clay floor. But they were alive. By sheltering directly behind the massive, reinforced wooden support columns at the deepest point of the dead end, and by being at the absolute epicenter of the initial ignition point where the outward shockwave rapidly pushed the lethal heat away from them, Cole had mathematically engineered their survival. The blinding, terrifying flash of the subterranean sun abruptly snapped out of existence, instantly plunging the collapsed, sealed tomb back into absolute, suffocating darkness. The heavy, metallic clink of the German shotguns was entirely gone. The rhythmic thud of the hobnailed boots was silenced. 10 abandoned, unarmed laborers had just weaponized the very air they breathed to entirely erase an elite infantry squad from the face of the earth. 14 agonizing hours after the catastrophic subterranean ignition, the deafening roar of the surface artillery finally ceased. The massive German counteroffensive had broken against the reinforced Allied lines, and the bloody, shattered trenches of the Argonne Forest were slowly being reclaimed in the pale, freezing morning light. Picking his way carefully through the mud and rusted barbed wire was the pristine, aristocratic lieutenant. His polished brass compass still gleamed perfectly against his tailored wool uniform. He was leading a heavily armed recovery squad back to the exact coordinates of the collapsed listening post, returning to the scene of his absolute, cowardly betrayal. In his rigid, academy-trained mind, the narrative was already perfectly written. He fully expected to look down the vertical mine shaft and find the butchered, shotgun-riddled bodies of 10 expendable African-American laborers. He was ready to write a sterile, heavily redacted report commending their sacrifice, while completely omitting the fact that he had explicitly locked them in a pitch-black tomb to save his own skin. But as the lieutenant approached the shattered remains of the heavy wooden trapdoor, his pristine leather boots stopped dead in the mud. A squad of Allied combat engineers was already furiously working a winch system over the hole. They were not pulling up corpses. One by one, hauled up from 40 feet below the earth, came the 10 African-American trench diggers. They were completely covered in thick black soot, dried clay, and the unmistakable, acrid stench of a massive chemical burn. They were exhausted, heavily bruised, and shivering in the autumn air. But they were entirely, undeniably, alive. The lieutenant's jaw dropped in absolute, paralyzing disbelief. He pushed past the engineers and looked down into the vertical shaft. The bottom of the tunnel was not just cleared, it was completely, violently terraformed. A colossal, impassable wall of scorched, melted bedrock and splintered timber completely sealed the enemy side of the corridor. The sheer magnitude of the catastrophic thermal explosion was written in the blackened, glass-like slag coating the remaining walls. It looked like a heavy artillery shell had detonated in a confined space, an absolute impossibility 40 feet underground. Sergeant Cole Davis, his massive shoulders heaving as he breathed in the fresh surface air, stepped off the winch line. The West Virginia coal miner wiped a thick layer of black soot from his heavily scarred face and stared directly through the cowardly officer. Cole did not salute. He just held the shattered, melted brass handle of the oil lantern. "Intersection held, Lieutenant." Cole's deep, gravelly voice cut through the morning mist. "Enemy raiding party has been entirely vaporized." The lieutenant stared at the colossal Appalachian miner, his aristocratic face flushing a violent, defensive crimson. He looked down at the massive, apocalyptic destruction 40 feet below, and then at the unarmed laborers holding broken iron shovels. "What in God's name happened down there, Sergeant?" the lieutenant stammered, his voice laced with sudden, terrified panic. "Did the Germans misfire a heavy demolition charge? Did a sapper tunnel collapse on them?" "No demolition charges, sir," Cole replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble of pure working-class fury. "We reversed the canvas blower, sucked the fire damp from the bedrock, suspended the dry chalk dust in the air, and shattered a lantern. We built a vacuum bomb. We burned them." The lieutenant stared at Cole in absolute, sickening denial. The mathematical brilliance of the trap, the fact that a segregated, blue-collar coal miner had engineered a highly complex, supersonic, thermobaric detonation using nothing but raw dirt, gas, and a fan, fundamentally shattered his deeply prejudiced worldview. Acknowledging that genius would completely humiliate him and his prestigious academy training. "You expect me to believe a squad of uneducated diggers built a chemical weapon in the dark?" the lieutenant spat, his voice echoing with absolute, arrogant dismissal. "That is mathematically absurd. A stray high-explosive artillery shell obviously penetrated the bedrock and caused a localized collapse. It was a freak accident of the bombardment." Cole's jaw locked tight. The 9 young diggers behind him froze, the crushing, suffocating weight of the profound betrayal settling over them in the freezing morning air. They had commanded the terrifying, invisible chemistry of the Earth, annihilated an elite apex predator without firing a single shot, and survived the darkest, most claustrophobic nightmare of the war. And the establishment was about to violently erase every single second of it. "You maliciously ignited a highly unstable subterranean gas pocket and deliberately destroyed a vital, strategic Allied listening post," the lieutenant screamed, his voice dripping with aristocratic venom, completely ignoring the sheer impossibility of the digger's survival. He turned frantically to his heavily armed military police escorts, who were staring down into the smoking, apocalyptic crater in absolute awe. "Master-at-arms!" the lieutenant barked, completely erasing the heroism of the laborers to protect his own shiny brass compass. "Confiscate their shovels immediately. Arrest Sergeant Davis. I am charging him with gross insubordination, dereliction of duty, and the unauthorized, willful detonation of military infrastructure." The heavily armed MPs nervously leveled their rifles at the 10 freezing, exhausted men who had just saved the entire trench line from a devastating subterranean flank. The betrayal was absolute, crushing, and infinitely heavier than the tons of shattered bedrock that had collapsed in the tunnel. They had looked at a pitch-black, inescapable tomb, weaponized the terrifying, invisible chemistry of the Earth, and entirely annihilated a squad of heavily armed killers. And their only reward was to be stared down by the guns of their own commanders, their unimaginable, physics-defying tactical genius completely erased, stolen, and buried by the very establishment that had locked them in the dark to die. This is the exact reason you will never find the name Cole Davis or the Subterranean Phantom in your standard World War I history textbooks. The Allied High Command completely sanitized the official trench logs. The catastrophic destruction of the elite German Stormtrooper raiding party was officially classified as a spontaneous localized artillery collapse. The 10 brave, blue-collar diggers were quietly reassigned to different labor battalions, their records permanently sealed, and their incredible, working-class brilliance completely buried beneath mountains of redacted, classified paperwork. But the truth is permanently scorched into the blackened, melted walls of the Argonne Forest bedrock. The truth lives in the calloused, chalk-stained hands of the working-class men who actually bleed in the deepest, darkest corners of the earth, while the cowards at the very top steal all the glory and hide the evidence. Tell me in the comments, have you ever pulled off the absolute impossible at your job? Saving a massive project from complete disaster, only to have a toxic, arrogant manager entirely steal your credit? Or worse, try to punish you for the way you fixed it? Flood the comment section with your stories right now, because exposing the truth is the only way we honor the ghosts of the mining shaft.